On the morning of March 17, 1983, in a dim safe house 3 blocks from the Spree River in East Berlin, a man named Viktor Orlov sat motionless at a wooden table, staring at a photograph he should have burned years ago. The image showed a child's hand clutching a silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon. He had taken the picture himself in another life when his daughter Anya was 4 years old. She would be 19 now, if she was still alive. Viktor folded the photograph into quarters and slipped it inside the lining of his boot, where it had lived for the past 15 years. Outside, a tram rattled past, its metal wheels grinding against frozen tracks. The sound reminded him of the permanence of routine, the weight of time passing without resolution. He stood, pulled on his gray overcoat, and checked the Makarov pistol holstered beneath his arm. The weapon was clean, oiled, ready. It had been ready for years. He was a ghost now. Not officially. Officially, Viktor Orlov was a mid-level translator for the Soviet Ministry of Culture, a man who processed immigration documents and attended forgettable meetings about film censorship and ballet tours. But in the narrow corridors where real power moved, Viktor was something else entirely. He was a fixer, a man who solved problems the KGB preferred not to acknowledge. He had no official rank, no public record of service. He existed in the margins of the apparatus, useful precisely because he could be denied. His daughter had vanished in 1968, during the Prague Spring. She had been with her mother visiting family in Czechoslovakia when the tanks rolled in. The official story was that they had died in the chaos. No bodies were ever recovered. No confirmation ever arrived. Just a single typed memo from Moscow, stamped with a red seal, informing him that his family had been lost to the turbulence of necessary intervention. The memo had been signed by someone whose name he didn't recognize. The signature was illegible. For 15 years, Viktor had searched, not openly, not foolishly. He had learned to read between the lines of reports, to notice discrepancies in deportation records, to follow whispers in the parts of the system where information flowed without form. He had traded favors, accumulated debts, and cultivated sources in cities he had never officially visited. And for 15 years, he had found nothing, until 3 days ago. A contact in the Stasi had passed him a file, not a complete file, just a fragment. A single page photocopied in haste showing the intake record of a young woman detained near the Hungarian border. The woman had no identification. She spoke Russian with a Czech accent. And when they searched her, they found a silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon. The record listed her as a suspected dissident. She was being held in a temporary facility in Erfurt, awaiting transfer to a permanent detention center. The facility was off the books. A gray zone where people waited to be processed into oblivion. Viktor had 48 hours before she was moved. After that, she would disappear into the system completely, swallowed by the vast machinery of state security that turned human beings into numbers and numbers into nothing. He left the safe house before dawn. The streets of East Berlin were empty except for a few workers trudging toward the factories near Friedrichshain. The air smelled of coal smoke and damp concrete. Viktor walked with the practiced anonymity of a man who had spent decades making himself forgettable. He wore no distinctive clothing. He kept his head down. He moved with the rhythm of someone who belonged. At Ostbahnhof, he boarded a train heading south. The compartment was nearly empty. An older woman sat near the window, clutching a shopping bag filled with turnips. She didn't look at him. No one did. That was the unspoken contract of life in the East. You saw nothing. You remembered nothing. Curiosity was a luxury reserved for the naive and the doomed. The train moved slowly through the gray landscape of the German Democratic Republic. Fields stretched flat and colorless under a low sky. Villages passed like faded photographs, their buildings gray and identical, their streets empty. Viktor watched the countryside roll by and thought about the mechanics of disappearance. How easy it was for a person to vanish. How the system had been designed, from the very beginning, to make certain people invisible. He thought about his daughter, about the last time he had seen her. She had been wearing a blue dress with white flowers. Her hair had been tied back with a ribbon. She had asked him if they could go to the park when she returned from Prague. He had said yes. He had promised. The pendant had been a gift from his wife's grandmother, a family heirloom passed down through 3 generations. It was not valuable in monetary terms, just silver, worn thin by time, but it carried weight. It meant something. And if the woman in Erfurt had it, there were only 2 possibilities. Either she was his daughter, impossibly alive after 15 years, or someone wanted him to believe she was. Viktor had considered the second possibility carefully. He was not naive. He understood how intelligence services operated. He knew that bait could be dangled, that traps could be set. But he also knew that the pendant was not common knowledge. Very few people would know to use it as leverage. And if this was a trap, it was a sophisticated one, which meant someone had invested time and resources into targeting him specifically. He arrived in Erfurt just after noon. The city was industrial and grim, its skyline dominated by smokestacks and housing blocks built in the functionalist style that defined the socialist vision of progress. Viktor checked into a small hotel near the train station, using false papers that identified him as a purchasing agent for a textile factory. The clerk barely glanced at the documents. He paid in cash and climbed 3 flights of stairs to a room that smelled of disinfectant and stale cigarettes. From the window, he could see the detention facility. It was an old Prussian-era building, converted after the war into administrative offices. The exterior was stone, blackened by decades of soot. Bars covered the upper windows. A single guard stood at the entrance, smoking and stamping his feet against the cold. Viktor spent the afternoon watching. He noted the shift changes, the delivery schedules, the comings and goings of staff. The facility was small, perhaps 20 detainees at most. Security was minimal. This was not a high-priority location. It was a holding pen, a bureaucratic way station where people waited to be sorted and shipped elsewhere. At 6 in the evening, he left the hotel and walked to a bar 3 streets away. The interior was dark and smoky, filled with factory workers drinking cheap beer and watching a football match on a television mounted above the counter. Viktor ordered vodka and sat in the back corner, waiting. The man he was meeting arrived 20 minutes later. His name was Klaus, a former Stasi officer who had been quietly pushed into early retirement after making the mistake of questioning an order. He was in his 50s, heavy and tired, with the resigned look of someone who had learned to accept his irrelevance. Viktor had used him before. Klaus was reliable because he no longer believed in anything except survival. They did not greet each other. Klaus sat down, ordered a beer, and slid a folded piece of paper across the table. Viktor opened it beneath the table and read the contents by feel more than sight. A floor plan, guard rotations, access codes. "The girl is on the 2nd floor, East Wing," Klaus said quietly, his eyes fixed on the television. "Cell 12. She's alone. They're moving her tomorrow morning at 7. How many guards on the floor?" 2 at night. 1 stationed at the stairwell, 1 makes rounds every 30 minutes. Cameras? In the main corridors. Not in the cells. Viktor folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. He placed a small envelope on the table. Klaus took it without looking inside. They sat in silence for a few more minutes, watching the football match neither of them cared about. Then Klaus stood and left. Viktor finished his vodka and walked back through the darkening streets. The temperature had dropped. Ice formed in the gutters. He thought about the mechanics of the operation he was planning. The risks were significant. If he was caught extracting a detainee from state custody, there would be no explanation sufficient to save him. He would be disappeared just like his daughter had been. But if he did nothing, if he let this moment pass, he would spend the rest of his life wondering. He returned to his hotel room and laid out his tools on the bed. Wire cutters, lock picks, a small canister of chemical irritant disguised as a lighter, the Makarov, loaded and checked. He worked methodically, testing each item, confirming its function. Preparation was the only certainty in an uncertain world. At midnight, he left the hotel through a side entrance and moved through the empty streets toward the detention facility. The city was silent. A few lights burned in apartment windows, but most of the buildings were dark. He approached from the east, staying in the shadows, moving with the patience of someone who had done this many times before. The perimeter fence was chain link, topped with barbed wire. Viktor followed it to a section behind a row of industrial bins where the lighting was poor. He used the wire cutters to create an opening large enough to slip through, then carefully bent the metal back into place behind him. From a distance, the fence appeared intact. He crossed the courtyard in a low crouch, keeping to the edges where the darkness was deepest. The guard at the front entrance was still visible, a glowing cigarette marking his position. Viktor moved around the side of the building to a service door Klaus had identified. The lock was old, a simple pin tumbler mechanism that took him less than 30 seconds to bypass. Inside, the building smelled of mildew and floor wax. The corridor was narrow and poorly lit, lined with offices whose doors bore faded labels in German and Russian. Viktor moved silently, his rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the linoleum floor. He found the stairwell and climbed to the second floor, pausing at the landing to listen. Voices drifted from somewhere down the hall. 2 men talking about a football match. The guards. Viktor waited until their conversation faded, then eased the stairwell door open and slipped into the corridor. The detention wing was separated from the administrative section by a heavy metal door with a small wire-reinforced window. Through the glass, Viktor could see a guard sitting at a desk, reading a newspaper. He checked his watch. According to Klaus's information, the roving guard would make his next round in 12 minutes. Viktor moved back down the corridor and found an empty office. He positioned himself by the door, waiting in the darkness, controlling his breathing. Minutes passed with the weight of hours. Then he heard footsteps approaching. The roving guard passed the office, walking with the bored rhythm of someone performing a task he had performed 1,000 times before. Viktor counted to 30, then stepped into the corridor behind the guard. He moved quickly, closing the distance in 4 strides. His arm locked around the man's throat in a practiced hold, cutting off blood flow to the brain without crushing the windpipe. The guard struggled for a few seconds, then went limp. Viktor lowered him to the floor, checked his pulse to confirm he was unconscious, then dragged him into the empty office and used plastic restraints to secure his wrists and ankles. He stuffed a rag into the man's mouth and closed the door. The guard's keys were on a ring attached to his belt. Viktor took them and moved back to the metal door separating the detention wing. Through the window, he could see the second guard still sitting at his desk, oblivious. Viktor opened the chemical irritant canister and slipped it beneath the door, then triggered the release mechanism. White vapor began to fill the corridor on the other side. Within seconds, the guard was coughing. He stood, confused, then stumbled toward the door. Viktor stepped aside as the man pushed through, gasping for air. Viktor struck him once, precisely, behind the ear. The guard dropped without a sound. The detention wing was now unguarded. Viktor moved quickly down the corridor, checking cell numbers. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. He looked through the small window in the door. A young woman sat on a narrow cot, her back against the wall. Her hair was dark and short, cut unevenly as if she had done it herself. Her face was thin, exhausted. She stared at nothing with the 1,000-yard gaze Viktor had seen in too many people who had been held too long. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The woman looked up, startled, her body tensing for violence or flight. "I'm not here to hurt you," Viktor said quietly in Russian. She didn't respond. Her eyes moved to the open door, calculating. "I'm here to get you out," Viktor continued. "But we have very little time." Still, she said nothing. Viktor reached into his coat and pulled out the photograph he had carried for 15 years. The image of the child's hand holding the silver pendant. He held it out toward her. Her expression changed. Something shifted behind her eyes. Recognition. Fear. Confusion. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "From a long time ago," Viktor said. "Do you have the pendant?" Slowly, Carefully, the woman reached beneath the collar of her shirt and pulled out a thin silver chain. At the end hung the crescent moon, tarnished and dented but unmistakable. Viktor felt something break open inside his chest. A dam held for 15 years finally giving way. He had imagined this moment countless times, but the reality was different. Sharper, more painful. "My name is Viktor Orlov," he said, "and I think you might be my daughter." The woman stared at him with an expression that contained no joy, no relief, only a deep and abiding weariness that came from years of surviving in places where trust meant death. She did not move from the cot. Her hand remained wrapped around the pendant, clutching it like a talisman against whatever new deception this might be. "I don't know anyone named Viktor Orlov," she said finally, her voice flat and careful. "You wouldn't remember," Viktor replied, keeping his distance, his hands visible and empty. "You were 4 years old the last time I saw you. In Moscow, before you went to Prague with your mother. My mother is dead." "I know, and you're telling me you're my father." There was no inflection in her words, no question mark. Just a statement of the absurdity she was being asked to accept. "I'm telling you that 15 years ago my wife took our daughter to visit family in Czechoslovakia. The day the tanks came, they disappeared. I was told they were dead. No bodies, no confirmation. Just a memo from Moscow telling me to move on with my life." Viktor paused, watching her face for any flicker of recognition. "The pendant you're wearing belonged to my wife's grandmother. I gave it to my daughter before she left. I have a photograph of her wearing it. Photographs can be faked. They can. This could be a trap. Another interrogation technique. Make me believe I have family so I'll talk." "It could be," Viktor agreed. "But if it were, I wouldn't have disabled 2 guards and broken protocol to get to you. I would have simply walked in with paperwork and a kind smile." She studied him in silence, her eyes moving across his face as if searching for something she couldn't quite name. Viktor recognized the look. It was the expression of someone trying to remember a dream from childhood, trying to separate real memory from the stories they had been told. "What was my name?" she asked. "If I'm your daughter, what was my name?" "Anya Viktorovna Orlova." Something flickered across her face. Not recognition exactly. Something deeper and more uncertain. A ghost of familiarity. "I don't remember that name," she said. "I don't remember anything before Prague. I remember the tanks. I remember my mother pulling me into a cellar. I remember the sound of gunfire. And then I remember waking up in a hospital with people telling me my mother was gone and asking me questions I didn't know how to answer." "What did they ask you?" "Who my father was, where he worked, whether he had ever spoken against the state." Her jaw tightened. "I told them I didn't know. I told them I didn't remember. And they didn't believe me." Viktor felt the cold mathematics of the situation arranging themselves in his mind. A 4-year-old child separated from her family during a violent suppression would be vulnerable, malleable, useful. The security services had a long history of repurposing orphans, particularly those with connections to sensitive personnel. They could be raised within the system, trained, controlled, turned into tools. "What happened after the hospital?" he asked. "I was moved to a state facility, a school they called it, but it wasn't like any school I've heard about since. We learned languages, surveillance techniques, how to read people, how to lie convincingly, how to disappear." She paused, her eyes never leaving his face. "They told me I was being prepared to serve the state, that I should be grateful for the opportunity. And the pendant? I've always had it. They tried to take it from me once when I was younger. I fought so hard they decided it wasn't worth the trouble. It was just a piece of silver. Not valuable enough to matter. But I never told them where it came from. I couldn't, because I didn't remember." Viktor processed this information with the clinical detachment that had kept him alive through decades of operating in the margins. If she had been trained by the security services, there was a strong possibility this entire encounter was theater. That she had been positioned here deliberately, that the pendant had been returned to her specifically to draw him in. But there were inconsistencies in that theory. If they wanted to trap him, they wouldn't have made it this difficult. They would have simply arrested him, unless the goal was an arrest. Unless the goal was something more complex. "We need to leave," Viktor said. "Now, before the shift change, why should I trust you?" Because in approximately 4 minutes, someone is going to discover those guards, and this entire facility will be locked down. And when that happens, your window for escape closes permanently. He met her eyes. I don't know if you're my daughter. I don't know if this is fate or manipulation or pure coincidence, but I know that if you stay here, you'll be moved to a permanent facility tomorrow morning. And permanent means exactly what you think it means. She stood slowly, her movements controlled and economical. She was taller than he had imagined, nearly his height. She wore the plain gray clothes of a detainee, thin fabric that offered no protection against the cold outside. Viktor removed his coat and held it out to her. Put this on. She hesitated, then took the coat and slipped it over her shoulders. It was too large for her, but it would provide cover and warmth. They moved quickly down the corridor, past the unconscious guard Viktor had restrained earlier. The man was still breathing steadily, his pulse strong. Viktor had no interest in killing anyone tonight. Death brought investigation. Investigation brought attention. And attention was the last thing either of them could afford. At the stairwell, Viktor paused and listened. The building was still quiet, but that silence wouldn't last. He led her down to the ground floor, moving through the administrative section toward the service door he had entered through. Behind them, somewhere in the distance, a door slammed. Voices called out in German, urgent and confused. They had been discovered. Viktor broke into a run, pulling the woman after him. They burst through the service door into the courtyard. Floodlights suddenly blazed to life, illuminating the grounds in harsh white light. An alarm began to wail, a mechanical shriek that cut through the night air. The fence, Viktor said. East side. Run! They sprinted across the open ground, exposed and vulnerable. Behind them, the front door of the facility crashed open. Shouts, the metallic click of weapons being readied. Viktor didn't look back. Looking back accomplished nothing. They reached the fence, and Viktor threw himself at the opening he had created, ripping the chain link wider with his bare hands. Metal bit into his palms, but he ignored the pain. He shoved the woman through first, then followed, feeling the barbed wire catch his shirt and tear. On the other side, they ran through the industrial area, weaving between buildings and storage containers. The alarm continued to wail behind them, joined now by the sound of engines starting. Search protocols being activated. Viktor knew they had minutes at best before roadblocks were established, before the entire city was locked down. He led her through a maze of back streets and alleys, moving with the certainty of someone who had memorized the geography beforehand. They emerged near the train station, but Viktor bypassed the main entrance. Too obvious, too monitored. Instead, he guided her to a small parking lot behind a freight depot where a battered Trabant sat waiting. Exactly where Klaus had promised it would be. Viktor opened the trunk and pulled out a canvas bag. Inside were clothes, identification papers, money, and a small first aid kit. He handed the bag to the woman. Change your clothes. Quickly. There's a restroom in that building. She took the bag without argument and disappeared into the shadows. Viktor checked the car's fuel tank. 3/4 full, and examined the papers Klaus had provided. 2 sets of identification, both showing them as married factory workers from Karl-Marx-Stadt, traveling to visit family in Leipzig. The documents were good, not perfect, but good enough to pass casual inspection. The woman returned wearing jeans, a heavy sweater, and a wool cap that covered her hair. She looked different, more ordinary. Less like someone who had just escaped state custody. Get in, Viktor said. They climbed into the Trabant, and Viktor started the engine. The 2-stroke motor sputtered to life with a thin, whining sound. He pulled out of the parking lot and headed west, away from the city center, keeping his speed moderate and unremarkable. Around them, Erfurt continued its evening routine, unaware that somewhere behind them, a full-scale search was beginning. They drove in silence for 20 minutes, following secondary roads that wound through industrial zones and residential blocks. Viktor checked the mirrors constantly, watching for pursuit. So far, nothing. The search would be focused initially on the immediate area around the facility. It would take time for them to expand the perimeter, to coordinate with checkpoints and border posts. Time was what Viktor needed. Time to get distance. Time to think. Where are we going? The woman asked. Her voice was calm, almost detached. West, Viktor said. To Berlin. And then? I don't know yet. She turned to look at him, studying his profile in the dim light from the dashboard. You really think I'm your daughter? I think it's possible, but you're not certain. No, I'm not certain. So you broke me out of detention based on a possibility. Yes, that seems irrational. Viktor allowed himself a thin smile. It does, doesn't it? They passed through a small village, its streets empty and dark. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Viktor thought about the variables in play, the forces now arrayed against them. The escape would be reported to the Stasi within the hour. From there, the information would flow upward through the security apparatus. Depending on who the woman really was, depending on what value she held, the response would scale accordingly. If she was simply a detained dissident, the pursuit would be routine and eventually abandoned. If she was something more, a trained asset, a piece in a larger game, then they would never stop hunting. Tell me about the pendant, Viktor said. When did you first remember having it? I've always had it, or at least I have no memory of not having it. It was with me in the hospital, it was with me in the school. I used to hold it at night when I couldn't sleep. Did you ever ask anyone about it? Once, an instructor at the school. She told me it was probably something my mother gave me before she died, that I should treasure it as a memory of her. Do you remember your mother? The woman was quiet for a long moment. I remember impressions, a voice singing, hands braiding my hair, the smell of bread baking, but I don't remember her face. Every time I try to picture her, there's just nothing, like a photograph that's been exposed to too much light. Viktor understood. Memory was fragile, especially childhood memory. The brain protected itself by forgetting trauma, by filling gaps with comfortable fictions. The girl he had lost might be sitting next to him right now, or she might be 15 years dead, and this might be someone else entirely. Someone who had been given a pendant and a story and sent to intercept a desperate man searching for his daughter. But if that was true, if this was an elaborate operation, then someone had gone to extraordinary lengths. And that implied something about Viktor that troubled him. It implied that he mattered more than he believed. That someone, somewhere, thought he was worth the investment of resources and time required to construct this scenario. What's your name now? Viktor asked. Marina Volkova. At least that's what the papers say. Do you know if that's real? I don't think anything about me is real. I think I'm a collection of stories and training exercises held together by muscle memory and habit. She paused. The only thing I know for certain is that pendant, and the feeling I get when I hold it. Like it connects me to something I've lost. They drove through the night, the Trabant's small engine laboring against the grade as they climbed into the low hills west of Erfurt. Viktor's hands ached where the fence had cut them, but the bleeding had stopped. He would deal with the wounds later. Right now, distance was the priority. At a crossroads, he turned north, following signs toward Gotha. The road was empty except for the occasional truck hauling freight between factories. The border between East and West Germany was still more than 100 kilometers away, but Viktor had no intention of attempting a crossing. Not tonight. Not with every security post between here and there being alerted to watch for escapees. Instead, he would go to ground. He would use the network he had built over 15 years, the favors owed and the safe houses maintained. He would find a place where they could wait while the initial fury of the search burned itself out. And then he would begin the careful work of determining the truth. "Are you in trouble because of me?" Marina asked. "I was already in trouble," Viktor said. "I've been in trouble for 15 years. Because you never stopped looking. Because I never accepted what they told me. Most people would have moved on. Most people didn't lose what I lost." She was quiet again, absorbing this. Then she said, "What if I'm not her? What if you risked everything for someone who's not your daughter?" Viktor kept his eyes on the road, watching the white lines disappear beneath the car. "Then I suppose I'll have saved someone else's daughter. That's not nothing, but it means she's still gone. She's been gone for 15 years. One more night won't change that. They reached the outskirts of Gotha as the first gray light of dawn began to soften the eastern horizon. Viktor drove through the quiet streets to a residential area where identical apartment blocks stood in neat rows, monuments to the socialist ideal of collective living. He parked the Trabant on a side street and killed the engine. "We'll wait here until full daylight," he said. "Then we'll move to a safe house I know in the city. We need to stay off the roads during the initial search period." Marina nodded. She had pulled the coat tight around herself, her hands buried in the pockets. In the growing light, Viktor could see her face more clearly, the shape of her cheekbones, the set of her eyes. He tried to overlay the image of his 4-year-old daughter onto this young woman's features, but the years had changed too much. Or perhaps his memory had distorted the original. He couldn't be certain. "The date on the photograph," Marina said suddenly. "The one you showed me. What was the date?" Viktor had to think back. "April 1968. 3 weeks before she went to Prague. The pendant has an inscription on the back. Did you know that?" Viktor's pulse quickened. "No." Marina removed the pendant from around her neck and turned it over in her palm. The silver caught the dawn light. "It's in Russian, very small. I never understood what it meant." She handed it to Viktor. He held it up to the light, squinting at the tiny engraved letters on the reverse side of the crescent-moon. His wife's grandmother had been a craftsman's daughter. She had believed in marking important things. The inscription read, "For Anya, who lights the dark." Viktor's hand began to shake. He had forgotten. 15 years had buried the memory, but now it returned with the force of physical impact. His wife's grandmother had inscribed those words the day before she died. She had called the little girl to her bedside and fastened the pendant around her neck and whispered something. Viktor hadn't heard. Later, his wife had told him about the inscription. The old woman had said that darkness was coming, that the world was entering a long night, and that Anya would need something to remind her that light was real. It had seemed like the mystical rambling of a dying woman, but she had been right about the darkness. "What does it say?" Marina asked quietly. Viktor's voice was hoarse when he answered. "It says, 'For Anya, who lights the dark.'" Marina was very still. "Anya, that's the name you said was mine." "Yes. And you didn't know about the inscription?" "No. I'd forgotten. Until now." They sat in silence as the sun rose over Gotha, painting the gray buildings in shades of pale gold. Around them the city began to wake. Lights appeared in windows. Doors opened. People emerged to begin another day of the endless present that defined life in the East. A present without past or future, only the continuous now of survival and compliance. Viktor looked at the woman, at Anya, if that was truly who she was, and saw in her face the accumulated weight of 15 years. Years of not knowing. Years of being shaped by forces neither of them could control. Years of living with absence and uncertainty and the hollow place where family should have been. "I don't know what happens next," he said finally. "I don't know if I can prove who you are or who I am. I don't know if we can survive what comes after this, but I know that I'm not leaving you again." Anya, he let himself think the name, let himself believe it might be true, looked at him with eyes that held something he couldn't quite identify. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of possibility. "Then I suppose we find out together," she said. Viktor nodded. He started the engine again and pulled back onto the street, driving deeper into the city where a safe house waited, where they could rest and plan and begin the impossible work of reclaiming what had been lost. Behind them, in Erfurt, the search would be intensifying. Reports would be filed. Orders would be issued. The vast machinery of state security would turn its attention toward finding 2 people who had violated the fundamental rule of the system. They had chosen each other over obedience. It was a choice that could only end one way. But for now, in the fragile morning light, with his daughter sitting beside him, Viktor Orlov allowed himself to feel something he had not permitted in 15 years.